morning, everyone. Obviously, welcome to the Longevity Leaders Virtual Trends and Impact Roundtable. As you all hopefully know, this morning's session is on smoking and vaping. My name is Matthew Pullen. As Stuart mentioned, I'm one of the directors here at LSX, which is the parent company of Longevity Leaders. My role this morning really is just to be on hand on the tech side. So I'll shortly hand back to Stuart, who's going to be your host for the session. But just a few points of note. We've obviously got a nice small interactive group here, and the idea of this session is very much to be as interactive as possible. So it should be seen as a genuine discussion. I'd really encourage you to be as forthcoming with questions and comments as possible. We're very lucky to have Robert West from UCL joining us. Robert will be giving a short presentation to kick things off, but after that, please feel free to jump in. Probably best to keep your audio muted while Robert's speaking, but after that, feel free to jump in with any comments or questions, as I mentioned. You can do that just by giving us a wave, giving Stuart a nod. If you want, you can put a question in the chat function that hopefully you're all familiar with. There's also a possibility of digitally raising your hand via the chat as well, if something comes to you in the middle of someone else's point. So lots of different ways to be interactive, get involved, ask questions. I would encourage you to do that. But without further ado, I'm going to hand back to Stuart officially, obviously today's host. Stuart is the head of demographic assumptions and methodology at Lloyd's Banking Group. So Stuart, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matthew. Yes, as Matthew said, you know, I'm responsible for all demographic assumptions within Lloyd's Banking Group. So, you know, principally that's matters in respect of human health, human behavior. That, you know, boils down to understanding what the risks are when we sell an insurance product, for example, and you know, which might be a protection product, critical illness. When we're selling annuities, understanding how long people are going to live, and so on. Clearly, that means a big interest in smoking. You know, as Robert will doubtless explain, smoking is one of the major drivers of differences in health that we see across the population, and a part of my role is trying to understand how risks vary between individuals. As well as my day job role, I also have a role within the CMI, so that's the continuous mortality investigation within the actuarial profession, who, you know, conduct lots of mortality investigations and produce a model used for forecasting future changes in life expectancy. So again, understanding how smoking behavior has changed historically and may in the future, very important for those factors. I'll introduce now Robert West. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to ask Robert lots of questions. He's a professor of health psychology at UCL, University College London, and editor-in-chief of the journal Addiction. He specializes in addiction and behavior change, and took his BSc and his PhD in psychology at UCL. He created the blueprint for the NHS Stop Smoking services, acts as advisor to Public Health England on its tobacco control strategy, and has authored around 900 scientific articles and several books, including The Theory of Addiction, The Smoke-Free Formula, and The Behavior Change Wheel, as well as Energize: The Secrets of Motivation. You can find him at rjwest.co.uk or on Twitter at Robert J. West. Robert, if I may, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's very interesting for me to be able to have a discussion with professionals, particularly working in fields of insurance and life expectancy, because one of the things I've noticed over the years is that very often the commercial world, people working in it and doing modeling in it, have insights that don't necessarily find their way into the academic world. And I used to do research into traffic accidents and did some work with Norwich Union on it, and they had a really fascinating load of data that I, really, actually I did get my hands on some of it and was able to write some stuff up. But I mean, so it's a very complementary set of experiences. So I'll be very interested to know how you, what you think about some of the things that I'm going to say. So I'm going to share my screen to, it's really just one slide. After the host has allowed me to. So it's really, as I say, it's just one slide, which just covers gives you the topics, and so hopefully you should be able to see that now. Yeah. Okay. And I'm just going to go through them one at a time, and then we can have a discussion about issues that arise from it. So first of all, obviously the issue of how smoking affects life expectancy, and this is an area that there's probably got the best epidemiology of pretty well any of the areas that we deal with. And not only do we have a pretty good idea of the effect of smoking, but unlike many other areas of behavior, like even things like diet and obesity and exercise, we actually have a pretty good idea about the impact of quitting. And this is largely because of the work of people like Richard Peto and Richard Doll originally, and then subsequently others. So the best data we had for a while was the British Doctors Study, which followed people up for about 40 years until almost all of them had died. And I'm sure if you're involved in this, you're familiar with that study. And they estimated for male doctors that if the average smoker, if they didn't stop, would lose 10 years of life expectancy. And then Richard Peto and colleagues did a similar thing with the Million Women study and found very, very similar drop in life expectancy with smokers who didn't stop. And the way that Richard put it was, well, if women smoke like men, they die like men, which is pretty typical of Richard's sort of robust attitude to things. But more importantly, probably than that, was the fact that they were able to look at the impact of quitting at various ages. And many of you are probably familiar with the curve. But the way I translate that curve when I'm talking to either smokers or other researchers or the journalists is that when you do the simple arithmetic on it, it works out at about 4 to 6 hours of life expectancy for every day of smoking avoided. So, and this is true throughout the lifespan. So essentially if you stop at a particular age, you just have to say, well, what's done is done. I've lost this amount of life expectancy, and other things being equal, if I stop now, from now on, I can live a 24-hour day, effectively, as opposed to an 18 to 20-hour day, which is what smokers are living. The other big issue that obviously smokers are interested in, and I guess if one's interested not only in life expectancy but also in healthcare costs and so on, is what happens to one's levels of disability and so on. I did quite a lot of work with NICE on this, and the overall conclusion was that those grey years of disability and pain and enhanced healthcare costs are about the same for smokers and non-smokers. They just occur later. So in a way, smoking takes out the middle years, the sort of relatively healthy years, and brings the unhealthy years forward. That seems to be the way it works. So it doesn't, I think a lot of smokers are worried that if they stop smoking, they're just going to have a horrible long old age. Well, that's not the case. They'll have a horrible long old age regardless, or not, depending on other circumstances. The other thing, obviously, that we know about smoking is that this loss of life expectancy doesn't really kick in until your 30s. So in a way, at least in terms of life expectancy, you can sort of get away with it up till about the age of 30 or so, probably. I mean, this is not everyone will by any means, but that seems to be the picture. So, but of course, this is, you know, these studies were done in countries like the UK and the US, and I don't know what the interest here is in the global picture, but because it's very different, obviously. If you've got countries where people are dying of other things, then the impact will be different. And to be honest, in many countries, you probably have if you work in those countries and have actuarial data, you probably have a better idea than I do about what the loss of life expectancy is when you've got people dying of infectious diseases and other sorts of things. So, but this would be in sort of developed countries, probably apply throughout Europe, I would imagine, or most of Europe, and the US and English-speaking countries. On the question of who is smoking, we recently published a paper in my group from England, looking at the situation, where the results were somewhat surprising. This was repeated cross-sectional studies over a period of over 10 years. And over the last 10 years, the broad characteristics of smokers in terms of their demography hasn't changed very much, surprisingly. There is a view that, which is perfectly understandable, that as smoking prevalence goes down, you get a sort of what they call hardening. That is to say, the smokers who are left are more sort of hardcore, and they're likely to be poorer and have other sorts of levels of disadvantage. But in England, actually, we haven't seen that. I think we do see it in some other countries. But one of the very special things about England and the UK is that we have had effective tobacco control strategies and treatment programs, which have, to some degree, mitigated the inequalities that you get when you have just a tobacco control strategy in which ultimately leads to better off people quitting and worse off people carrying on smoking because they're more dependent. So we have mitigated that to some degree in the UK. Now, the other interesting thing I think for people is the age at which people quit. And obviously you want people to quit as young as possible. And what you see is that there is a sort of slight uptick in quitting among women around childbearing age. But overall, men and women quit at the same rate in the UK and the US, which is contrary to what a lot of people think, but it's the case. They quit at around the same rate. Younger people are more interested in trying to quit. They try to quit more, but older people are more successful. And this tends to balance out. So apart from that sort of blip, you tend to see a fairly flat sort of picture. Many of you probably know the best ways of quitting. Well, or maybe you don't, but you know, time and time again, we see that the most effective way to quit is a combination of pharmacotherapy and behavioural support of the sort that until recently was pretty widespread in the UK. And unfortunately now, because of both financial cutbacks, but also the transfer of public health from NHS, or from smoking services from NHS to local authorities, that's led to a fragmentation and a degradation of the services in many areas. But this specialist behavioural support is support which contains a number of defined behaviour change techniques which have proven effectiveness, and then you combine those with a pharmacotherapy. Pharmacotherapy is primarily varenicline or Champix, which is a prescription medication, or some form of nicotine replacement therapy, which would be nicotine patch, gum, nasal spray, lozenge. And with nicotine replacement therapy, then it's very, very important to use two forms at the same time, basically patch plus one of the faster acting forms, because you get better results with that. A lot of people don't realize that, and most people who try to quit with nicotine replacement therapy only use one form, which is a shame, because they could get better results if they quit with two forms. Now, onto the thorny subject of e-cigarettes. It's obviously become quite controversial. And And the interesting, obviously from a scientific point of view, e-cigarettes are a very interesting phenomenon. When they first emerged on the market, to be quite honest, the levels of nicotine delivery from them were quite poor and weak. And so they had very little more than a placebo effect. But as the technologies improved, and particularly battery technology, which means that you can heat the coil and get a better nicotine dose off your e-liquid, then the modern e-cigarettes can deliver nicotine very similar to a cigarette. Now, for those of us who've taken the view that smoking is essentially a form of nicotine self-administration, that then raises a question: why wouldn't just everybody who smokes quite easily switch to an e-cigarette? It would seem like a complete no-brainer, notwithstanding the fact that you do get stories around that e-cigarettes are just as harmful as cigarettes, and that unfortunately has become even more problematic recently. I mean, it isn't true, but certain newspapers, and I'm afraid some of my academic colleagues, have propagated this idea that e-cigarettes are as harmful or more harmful. But certainly in the earlier days, most smokers would have accepted that e-cigarettes are considerably less harmful while not being completely safe. And so, if you can get your nicotine in a way that is less likely to kill you, why wouldn't you just do that? But that's not what happened. There was a large increase in the US, UK, and many other countries that permitted e-cigarettes from 2011 to about 2014-15. And then since then, e-cigarette use has plateaued or possibly even declined more recently. And it did it at a level of around 30% of quit attempts, which was actually not that different from prior use of nicotine replacement therapy. So when nicotine replacement therapy was in its heyday, about 35% of smokers would use nicotine patches or gum or whatever to try to stop, and about a substantial proportion, more than a quarter, would be using nicotine replacement therapy and smoking at the same time to try to reduce the amount they smoke. So it was very popular, and e-cigarettes haven't surpassed that. So, people who thought that this was going to be a complete game changer and transform the smoking landscape, I'm afraid, have been somewhat disappointed. So there's a conundrum there. If it's all about the nicotine, then it ought to be a lot easier to switch from a cigarette to an e-cigarette than it is. Having said that, we now got pretty good randomized controlled trial evidence, which tells us that e-cigarettes are more effective than the other forms of nicotine replacement therapy in helping people to stop. And so if stopping smoking is one's goal, then an e-cigarette is probably the key, a better method of doing it. There is a downside to it, which is that if you follow people up for a year or so or more, you find that far more people are still using the e-cigarette after a year. About 80% are still using the e-cigarette after a year, whereas if they've quit with some other method like nicotine gum, then it's only about 25%. So e-cigarettes probably do maintain nicotine use and probably nicotine dependence for a long time. So that raises the critical question of how harmful they are relative to smoking or relative to breathing fresh air. And so that's the next question. And of course, the answer is that in epidemiological terms, we won't know for an awful long time, and we may never know. And the reason for that, which many of you, or some of you probably are aware of, is that there's such strong confounding with smoking, because it's extremely rare, even in the US, where they say there's an epidemic of e-cigarette dependence. It's extremely rare for someone who's never smoked to start using an e-cigarette. In the UK, it's around 0.2%. So it's, and in America, it's higher. They have they have somewhat different problems in the US because they haven't been regulating e-cigarettes and their marketing in the way that we have. So it's going to be very difficult to disentangle. And if it's, as is extremely likely from the constituents of the e-cigarette vapor, that the e-cigarettes are substantially less harmful than smoking, imagine what it's going to be like to try to pick that up. Because as I was saying earlier, if you take up smoking at the age of 14, 15, 16, you don't start to lose life expectancy until you've been smoking into your 30s. So if e-cigarettes are a tenth, even a tenth as harmful, then we're not going to really pick this up until for some time. So so in judging the harm, we have to do it on the basis of other sorts of evidence. And what Public Health England have done, which has led to their famous 95% safer claim, was that they looked at the toxins in the e-cigarette vapor and the concentrations of those toxins, and what they saw, and others have seen, well, they reviewed the evidence. So that what they found that people have seen is that most of the harmful chemicals in the tar of cigarettes are just not present at all. And those that are present in much, much lower concentrations, usually an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude lower. Then there's the question of whether the vehicle itself, which is the propylene glycol or the glycerol, because you can think of it as like a particle, whether the very fact that it's a particle and you're inhaling a particle may contribute to coronary heart disease. And the reason for that is that we know that particulates around PM 2.5 have an effect on heart attacks, particularly, and risk of myocardial infarction. So the question is that just because it's a particle, and it doesn't matter what that particle is, whether it's propylene glycol or glycerol, or does it actually matter what that particle is? And from my discussions with respiratory epidemiologists at St George's, I think it does matter what the particles is, because these glycerol and propylene glycol are water soluble, obviously. Otherwise, they'd kill you. So it seems that the mechanism by which you get an immediate risk of an MI, or increased risk of an MI, if you inhale particulates, this is what I'm told, is that the body produces macrophages in order to be able to get rid of those particulates. When those macrophages break down, they release prothrombin, which is a clotting agent in the blood. So it's essentially inhaling particulates immediately, like within minutes or hours, makes your blood stickier. And if you're someone who's got a somewhat compromised vascular system, then it could be enough to tip the balance to having an MI, which is why you see an increase in MIs on days of high pollution in cities and so on. So that's the mechanism. So the key here would be whether the e-cigarette vapor prompts this increase in macrophage production. There isn't much work on it, but I have found a study which looked as though it probably didn't, and you wouldn't expect it to necessarily because of the nature of the particles. So that's one aspect of the potential harm. Now, inhaling anything into the lungs is obviously, which is not fresh air, is potentially going to cause a reaction like an inflammatory response. Nicotine itself is an irritant and will probably cause an does cause an inflammatory response. So that would be potential harm, and that in the long term could result in COPD or some other similar kind of disease state. So to my mind, that's the most likely way that an e-cigarette would cause harm. But we still don't know. But I think that if I was to judge a person's life expectancy as a long-term e-cigarette user, I would have it much closer to that of a non-smoker than to a smoker. And then lastly, the issue of gateway has been very thorny. The Americans are really keen on the idea that e-cigarettes use among young people then in this classic sort of gateway phenomenon that we heard so much about in the 1970s, or cannabis being a gateway into heroin and so on. By the way, cannabis isn't a gateway into heroin. The evidence isn't there at all. And but the idea was they'd start on e-cigarettes and then they'd move into smoking. Now, you cannot, unfortunately, use the sort of standard, even prospective studies with individuals to test that hypothesis, because the problem of confounding is just so huge. There are so many commonalities between the types of people who would start to use an e-cigarette and would start to smoke that picking those apart is too difficult. But so the best way to do it is to look at the population level, which addresses that issue of individual confounding. And both in the United States and the UK, what we've seen is that the rate of decline in youth smoking following this increase in e-cigarette use has not been mitigated. In other words, and it hasn't gone up and it hasn't gone down. We see no impact whatsoever. So at the moment, the way things are at the moment in the studies, in the countries that have been studied, it's extremely unlikely that at a population level, e-cigarettes are acting as a gateway into smoking among young people. The caveat to that is, as I mentioned a bit earlier, that there are so few people in countries like the UK that start on an e-cigarette that it would have to be a very strong gateway for those to then go on to be more likely to smoke. It's much more common the other way around, that people start smoking and then they start using an e-cigarette. And the other point about which is interesting from a scientific point of view about e-cigarettes, is that whereas with smoking, the conversion rate from trying a cigarette to becoming a regular dependent smoker is around 70%. It's highly addictive, cigarettes. The conversion rate from being an e-cigarette user to becoming a regular dependent e-cigarette user seems to be only around 20%. So that this is leading people like me to the hypothesis that cigarettes actually may have more to them in terms of their dependence potential than the nicotine. And the favorite hypothesis at the moment is that they all, because part of this we already know, is that they also contain at least one monoamine oxidase inhibitor. A monoamine oxidase inhibitor is a chemical that stops you breaking down your neurotransmitters like dopamine in the brain. What that means is if nicotine is causing dopamine release, that dopamine release is really important to the dependence, which we believe it is. If you've got another chemical which is keeping that dopamine hanging around for longer at higher concentrations, it's like an amplifier of the nicotine effect. So you've got nicotine driving dopamine release, you've got an MAO inhibitor preventing it being broken down, and you've potentially got a really effective cocktail of drugs for promoting dependence, and that may be what's going on. And that would also help to explain why smokers find it more difficult than you'd expect to switch from a cigarette to a pure nicotine delivery system. And then finally, the issue of what on earth is going to happen post-COVID. In the UK, we've just got the data in from our first post-COVID survey in our series, the Smoking Toolkit study, where we survey the population monthly, and there has been an uptick in quitting. So COVID does seem to have provided something of a prompt, but if our experience with other shocks is anything to go by, using the term shock in a sort of economist sense, I wouldn't expect that to be sustained. I think that people will get used to the post-COVID world, and that whatever the trend has been in smoking prevalence will continue. And just on that, the smoking prevalence in the UK is currently just under 15%, and it is going down at a rate of 0.6% a year, and that has been almost linear since the year 2000. Roughly, there's been a few sort of bumps and lumps, but pretty much linear, and which is kind of in itself, just to finish on, it's kind of interesting because as smoking prevalence goes down and starts to hit sort of a rump, not because of the characteristics of smoking, but just because of the statistics of it, you would expect that the rate of decline would slow because there are just fewer smokers to give up. And in order to get smoking prevalence down, you've at the same rate, a higher proportion of the existing smokers have to be giving up, and because the impact of take up of smoking is pretty modest on it in any 1 year to smoking prevalence, and yet it's been going down at a pretty linear rate. So it will be interesting to see what happens, but I'm reasonably optimistic that we can keep this going at around 0.6 percentage points a year in the UK. Other countries are hitting some problems. Australia's hit a bit of a wall just recently, but you never know. You know, sometimes you think, well, you get a bad year, and you think, well, oh dear, well, that's the end of that. You know, but then it sort of picks up again. So it's tricky. But globally, I would say the picture's nothing like as rosy in terms of reduction in smoking prevalence. And in Europe, continental Europe, it's not as rosy either. The situation is pretty dire in countries like Germany. France has had a pickup in the reduction in smoking prevalence since it introduced some sort of more effective tobacco control measures. But one of the things we do know is that tobacco control measures do make a difference. Smoking prevalence doesn't go down by itself. If you don't do anything, smoking prevalence won't go down and might even go up. So you've got to keep bearing down on it in order to be able to keep that prevalence going down. So I've probably gone on, well, I have gone on longer than I should have, but hopefully it gives you a bit of context, and then I'm very happy to discuss any points with you.
No, fascinating, Robert. I didn't jump in because, you know, it's all really, really interesting. And for me, at least, incredibly well targeted. You know, I've been ticking off my questions as you covered them, and you know, you covered a good number. I've scribbled down a few themes, and that I think it would be good to pick up on. So, socioeconomics was one. Change in prevalence over time, past and future, was another. What works for quitting? So incentives versus legislation was another. E-cigarettes was another, although I think you covered that really thoroughly. So I'm sort of 50-50 whether we should go back there. And you know, COVID as the topic of the moment, and international differences. So I just wondered, maybe by show of hands, you know, to get a theme of where we should start. Who would be interested in starting with socioeconomics? 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's be democratic. So let's start there. You know, you covered a 10-year difference between smoker and non-smoker life expectancy, and that immediately made me think of the 10-year difference that we see, or 9, between the 10% most deprived decile in the population and the 10% least deprived. Now, we know a big part of that difference is explained by smoking, lifestyle behaviors, you know, obesity, lack of exercise. I should say, especially with John here, because my public health colleagues have a tendency to remind me at this point, you know, it's not just the lifestyle factors. Why is it that they're smoking, Stuart? So, you know, this isn't, please don't interpret an accusatory tone from pointing out that
the mantra would be, what are the causes of the causes? No,
absolutely. Yeah. So I'm, you know, well aware that we can't just point to people and say, hey, quit smoking, live longer, or improve your diet. But the other interesting thing, of course, is, you know, whilst that 10 years seems to correlate quite well in life expectancy, superficially, you might just go there and say, hey, it's all about smoking. But actually, there's a 20-year near enough difference in healthy life expectancy. And you've explained that actually smoking, unlike obesity, doesn't, you know, it doesn't extend that morbidity period. You know, you have the same length morbidity period, it just comes earlier. So can you talk a little bit about how smoking prevalence has varied between socioeconomic groups historically, and maybe how it does today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and it is a very good point about the causes of the causes. That's absolutely right. And my ex-boss, Michael Marmot, obviously, and I have had discussions about this. I think that I think there's some quite complex interactions going on here because just relating to the smoking itself, it isn't just smoking prevalence that differs across the socioeconomic groups. It's also how much they smoke and the dependence and what they take and their exposure. So if you are a smoker from a more deprived group, you inhale more tar from your cigarettes. And more nicotine and so on. So you're getting a double whammy there. You also find it harder to stop. There's no question about that. However,
is that social reasons as well as, why is it harder to stop?
There's a number of candidate explanations. One is that is nicotine dependence. Because you're taking in more nicotine for whatever reason, then that in itself will contribute to that. But of course, your social circumstances and life circumstances also make it harder to stop. And the fact that you're almost certainly encountering more smokers in your environment. So you've got all the external factors, you've got the internal factors. And one thing I should say, of course, is that what I've been talking about is the broad sweep of socioeconomic status and deprivation. There are groups now at the bottom end here in terms of disadvantage for whom the situation is not looking anything like as good. And in terms of social circumstances, we recently identified people living in social housing as a particularly high risk group. And now it's probably a marker for something, but there may also be environmental factors as well. And one of the things I've been trying to do is to work with local authorities to get them to target social housing. And one reason why that's so interesting and so important is because the difference here, the risk from being in social housing, is not because they're not trying to stop, because they're trying to stop at least as much and then at least as motivated to stop smoking as people in the leafy suburbs. It's just that they're struggling to do it. They're less likely to be successful. To me, that says get stop smoking services on the doorstep in people living in social housing, and they will take it up and they will benefit from it. So there's that. And there's mental health, obviously, is a key factor. And we know also that people with mental health problems are as motivated to quit as anyone else and try to quit as much as anyone else, but struggle. So I think increasingly we're going to see that we'll be needing to target support for quitting to these groups. And it's going to have to be better than it was. And it can be, there's a smokers clinic in Prague that does everything that we would want a smokers clinic to do. And they get really good success rates with really difficult, high risk patients, people with schizophrenia and so on. They're getting like 40% 1 year quit rates, which we could only dream of. I mean, astonishing. And I have looked at their data and these are biochemically verified. So it can be done. But you're right. But the other point I think that's that you make was actually in relation to things like obesity, because I think I may be wrong, but it looks to me as obesity has a particularly damaging effect on people's lives without necessarily killing them.
Yeah.
And that is that is and it makes obviously use of healthcare services and so on more problematic. So they are different in terms of their relationship with socioeconomic.
No, that juxtaposition with obesity is exactly what I've seen in investigations I've conducted. I wonder if I could bring in one of the panelists. Is anyone keen to come in? John, I see you've unmuted.
Yeah, I would wondering if it would be helpful to try and attempt to link some of these levels. So, Robert, when you were talking about, or the way I converted it from a more technical language into my own thinking is, nicotine produces something that makes people feel good, but tobacco also has this inhibitor that makes sure that thing that's released that makes people feel good sort of stays kind of swimming in people's systems for a bit longer. And then I think that then links to this issue of who who is in more need or has more desire of feeling good. It's the people who feel bad. And so that's how these levels get connected. There's also the fact that you were talking about, where any kind of small particle, but especially maybe in tobacco, is an irritant that creates this sort of immune response that thickens the blood. And again, thinking Michael Marmot, where I was fascinated by his mention of fibrinogen, which I guess is kind of linked conceptually to this, another blood thickening agent, which almost gets to quite a coarse evolutionary thinking about why would you need clotting factors to be released in higher, why would you have these at higher gradients in people who are lower in the socioeconomic status? It's because maybe at some point in the evolutionary prehistory, these were the people who were more likely to be physically attacked. If they were physically attacked, it would be more advantageous for them to be able to kind of clot those wounds. But when that form of attack is psychological rather than physical, it then becomes entirely sort of maladaptive. So I can see, for those at the lower level of the socioeconomic gradient, you've got this sort of heightened immune response, which leads to the blood being more of a challenge in terms of the cardiovascular system, having to make the heart work faster, which means that it degrades faster, because you can almost think about the heart just having a certain number of cycles in a lifetime. And then also you've got, it produces these psychological effects, which then creates more need or more of a desire for some kind of compensatory behavior in terms of seeking ways of feeling better. But that way of feeling better, especially when it comes to tobacco, further thickens the blood and does further damage, chronic damage, and harm to the cardiovascular system. That's
really interesting.
Yeah.
I'll come in if I may. I wondered if I could bring Panikos in before I give Robert a chance to respond. Thank you, John.
Yeah, sure, thanks. Mine was probably more of a naive one. I guess the cost of smoking is so high. I mean, not that I've tried to smoke recently, but I've gone into a shop and it's like, I know, 5-10 quid or whatever for a pack. Why isn't that more of a deterrent in the low socioeconomic groups?
This is a very interesting question, which we've just recently been looking at very closely, and you get some. This is where it gets a little complex to understand. But basically, if you and it relates up to the psychopharmacology of it. Essentially, if you imagine that a smoker is trying to get a certain level of nicotine from a daily dose of nicotine, if you like, they can get. A cigarette is capable of delivering 6 milligrams of nicotine fairly easily if you really smoke it intensively. The average smoker gets about 1 to 1.5 milligrams of nicotine. There's a massive amount of headroom in every cigarette for getting the nicotine that you want and need. So what's happened is that as the price of cigarettes has risen, people have reduced the number of cigarettes they smoke, as well as trading down in terms of the type of cigarette they smoke. So there's a lot more hand-rolled now being smoked. But essentially, they can maintain their nicotine levels with fewer cigarettes. So the average cigarette consumption now is around 11 or 12. It used to be over 20. But they're still getting the same nicotine concentrations and the same tar and everything else. And what that means is that the cost of smoking has not gone up, I'm surprised as it may seem, has not gone up in real terms in the last 10 years. And obviously there's issues around smuggling and counterfeit and so on, but that actually has made a very small contribution to this. It's mainly a reduction in the number of cigarettes per day and the type of cigarette they smoke. So what you see with the lower income smokers is that they're much more likely to smoke hand-rolled tobacco than manufactured cigarettes, and that cuts their cost by about half. And a large reason for that is because the duty. And so one of the things we've been trying to get the government to do, and it started to do, is to increase the duty on hand rolls so it's in line with that of manufactured cigarettes. And that may well make a difference. But so the cost of smoking, but one, you make a really important point that relative to the amount of their available income, the cost of smoking for poorer people is much, much higher, and is actually driving many of them into poverty.
Thank you.
Not just in the UK, but in Australia. Yeah.
Really important point. Joel, I think you were looking to come in?
Yes. So while we're talking about manufactured and hand-rolled cigarettes, I'm wondering if I can get your view on menthol cigarettes have just been banned in the UK.
And hand-rolled too, I thought. Is that right?
No, hand-roll's not banned, no.
Oh, okay.
Just menthol flavouring in tobacco.
Do you think that's going to make any difference? No?
No, I don't know where that came from. It's nonsense.
I don't see that people can just buy their own menthol filters and just roll their own ones.
Well, so it comes from a view that menthol in cigarettes as a flavouring makes them more attractive to young people and allows people to inhale the smoke more and thereby get more dependent on the nicotine. But it's a sort of fetishization of flavorings that you're seeing with e-cigarettes as well, and unfortunately, it's not really backed up by evidence. So I would be very surprised if it made the slightest bit of difference to anything. I've been wrong before, but I still would be surprised.
Yeah, I wondered if it was a sort of out-of-date perception that it was a gateway, maybe 20 years ago, before e-cigarettes were around. People might have experimented with menthol cigarettes at an earlier age. I was interested in the point you made about on gateways. E-cigarettes not particularly being a gateway, and I was wondering if we could tie that to you mentioned physiological points, but I wondered if there was anything behavioral as well in the different way people seem to smoke them. People seem to get that full intense experience of a cigarette, smoke the whole thing in one go, and maybe just have one puff of an e-cigarette, pop it back in the pocket, go back to it later. That seemed to tie to the other points you made about quitting and the difference between fast and slow nicotine.
So to be clear, on the gateway hypothesis, it's at a population level that we don't see evidence of a gateway. At an individual level, there may be, there may be cases where people individually have started on e-cigarette and go on to smoke, and they wouldn't have done if they hadn't started on e-cigarette. But that may be a counterbalanced by other people who start on e-cigarettes, and because they're on e-cigarette, they don't go on to smoke. So that side of things is still, I think, unclear. But you're absolutely right. The pattern of use of e-cigarettes is very different from that of cigarettes, and it's down to the physics of it, really. A cigarette burns down in around 10 minutes. Typically, if you take about an average of 10 puffs on it, whereas your e-cigarette is available for however long you want to use it. And so a lot of e-cigarette users will do, the term they use is grazing. It's more like, you'll do it sort of every now and then, and rather than in bursts. What effect that has on things like dependence and so on, we honestly don't know. But what I think is clear, what we do know is that the overall nicotine level that people end up with is pretty much the same. So nicotine is an interesting drug that below a certain level, nothing. Above a certain level, toxic. You know, you actually feel, I mean, not toxic, it's not going to kill you at that level, but you just, it's not nice. You won't, you know, it's not a pleasant experience. And so there's this narrow dosing window that smokers have, and it's different for different smokers. And if they can stay within that window, then, you know, they're comfortable with it in whatever way they do it. But the other thing, of course, is that there are more situations in which you can use an e-cigarette than there are smoking. So all of these factors are going to come to play a role, I think.
Really interesting. Does anybody want to come in with a question? I'm conscious of time.
Just very quickly, I'm thinking from a modelling perspective, the gateway in and the gateway out, and people transitioning between these states of non-smoker e-cigarettes. Is the data available? Has the modelling exercise been done to represent this? You know, using something like like Markov modelling, where each of these states is a different thing, and there are transition probabilities over time.
Yeah. There's a guy called David Levy in the States who has a pretty well established Markov model for tobacco-related harm, and he's just it's not published yet, but he just showed us a draft of his latest one on looking at e-cigarettes and modeling health impacts and so on. So if you email me, I'm sure he'd be happy to send you that. But yeah, and obviously you have to put in some sensitivity analysis in terms of what you think the likely harms are from e-cigarettes. But the other thing to bear in mind is that we still don't know whether e-cigarette use, the people who stop smoking with the aid of an e-cigarette, are going to carry on using the e-cigarette for the rest of their life. They may well not, as Deirdre, I think, has said, you're trying to stop. And a lot of e-cigarette users do try to stop. And interestingly, they have a way of doing it which you can't do with a cigarette, and that's reducing the amount of nicotine in the e-liquid. And so I do know quite a lot of e-cigarette users who basically just dial down the nicotine concentration until they're just using something without any nicotine in. And for some people, that may well work. For others, you may need to transition through another nicotine replacement therapy or something like that. But I think it's very likely that the average duration of use of an e-cigarette will be much less than smoking. People will come off e-cigarettes probably 5, maybe 10 years rather than the whole lifetime.
Brilliant. Deirdre, can I bring you in for a question or comment?
Just a quick one, hopefully in the last few seconds. There's suggestion that we're going to go through a recession. Do we see a reduction, or do we see an increase in smoking when we're going through recessions?
We looked at that with the last one, 2008, 2009, and to be honest, didn't really see much of an impact. And I've looked at it using, historical data with the Depression back in the 1930s. And again, you don't see that much of an impact. So I'm not expecting a big effect. And I think one can speculate on the reason. One is that obviously if people don't have as much money, that's going to be a downward pressure on smoking. But at the same time, they've got more stress and more, if they're unemployed, they've got more time on their hands. So that's an upward pressure on smoking. And it may be that you've got a number of different countervailing factors coming into play. So I would be surprised if a recession in and of itself made any difference. I think it's possible, depending on how the data turns out, on the relationship between smoking and COVID disease severity, which is we haven't talked about, but we're doing a living review of the data as it's coming in on this, because some people have suggested it might be protective, but actually the evidence at the moment doesn't really support that. But if it turns out that this COVID risk becomes endemic, as it were, and people continue to worry about it over a long period, that might be a continuing downward, provide continuing downward pressure on smoking. But if I had to bet my house on it, which I wouldn't, I would say it's unlikely to have a big impact overall.
No, it's fascinating. I mean, we touched briefly on COVID, and I appreciate we're approaching our time limit, but You know, it struck me that there's a few points of interest there on COVID-19. I mean, firstly, the behaviour, the enforcement that we've seen in some countries. So South Africa, for example, banning cigarettes during the lockdown. The point you've already covered, which is these strange relationships coming out of early studies. So I think it's clear that former smokers are experiencing worse mortality, but this may be strange confounding possibly where current smokers are not obviously experiencing heavier mortality, and indeed, you know, in some studies, the opposite has been implied. But also, yeah, and I think we touched on this briefly, whether COVID-19 may lead to just an increased focus on population health, you know, from governments, but also from individuals.
I think that's a really good point, and I think these things are not set in stone. So, if I was Secretary of State for Health in any of the home nations, I would be using this opportunity for messaging around health and lifestyle in a very positive way to try to shape the agenda. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing that very much, but I think it would be, you know, if that were done, this is a, you know, we talk about teachable moment. I think it is a teachable moment, and we could get some benefit out of it.
No, wonderful. I couldn't agree more. And you know, I think a call to action like that might be an appropriate place to close. I found that an absolutely fascinating discussion, Robert, and thank you to everybody for your interesting and valuable contributions. Matthew, shall I hand over to you?
Yeah, no, just to echo what you said there, thank you very much for joining this session, everyone. I think it was you know, really interesting, some fascinating insight. Hope you all took some value out of that. A very big thank you to Stuart and Robert for their contributions. Robert, for your excellent presentation and comments, and Stuart for your excellent marshalling and moderating of the session. Really appreciate that. I'll just point you all towards the Longevity Leaders virtual event still going on this afternoon. There's a whole bank of presentations, panels, discussions from the last 3 days. Please feel free to go on and view those. They are available for 30 days anyways. Dip in and out whenever you want. There's a few live sessions going on this afternoon as well, and there's obviously lots of opportunity for networking and partnering on the system. But yeah, apart from that, thank you once again for all of your contributions this morning, and yeah, have a good day to all of you.